I was just going to write about one aspect of the Diddy case that I thought was interesting, which was his relationship with the supermodel Naomi Campbell, mainly because I had sort of gone down this avenue of research with respect to my work on Jeffrey Epstein that I hadn't published yet, involving her and Epstein. And so I thought it would be interesting to explore how she sort of intersects both worlds. But then, in doing that, kind of realized there were more intersections to be had, including the current president, among other figures, Ron Burkle being another one.
Most people still see the Diddy case as another celebrity scandal, another powerful entertainer accused of horrific crimes. But Whitney Webb is pointing viewers towards something much larger than Sean Combs himself. A network of oligarchs, music executives, intelligence-linked figures, organized crime connections, and financial interests that existed long before Diddy ever became famous. And here's the thing. The most disturbing part of these cases is not the celebrity at the center of them. It's the recurring pattern surrounding them. Because according to Whitney Webb, figures like Epstein and Diddy don't rise to that level of power in isolation. They are enabled, protected, financed, introduced to powerful circles, and once you start following those relationships, the entertainment industry stops looking like entertainment, it starts looking like infrastructure. Whitney Webb explains that her interest in the Diddy case actually began through Naomi Campbell, specifically through overlap she discovered between Naomi Campbell, Jeffrey Epstein, and broader elite networks she had already been researching for years. And according to her, that overlap quickly expanded into something much bigger.
I was just going to write about one aspect of the Diddy case that I thought was interesting, which was his relationship with the supermodel Naomi Campbell, mainly because I had sort of gone down this avenue of research with respect to my work on Jeffrey Epstein that I hadn't published yet, involving her and Epstein. And so I thought it would be interesting to explore how she sort of intersects both worlds. But then, in doing that, kind of realized there were more intersections to be had, including the current president, among other figures, Ron Burkle being another one.
That's important because it immediately reframes the Diddy case away from isolated celebrity misconduct and toward interconnected elite circles. Whitney Webb specifically points out that many of the same oligarch families, financiers, and influence networks appearing in Epstein research also emerge around the music industry. And once those overlaps appear repeatedly, they stop looking coincidental.
Broader network. And, a lot of the people, oligarch figures that pop up in my book, the Bronfman family, for example, I had an outsized influence on the record industry and on hip hop in the 1990s and beyond. And some of that intersects with other aspects of my Epstein research that I sort of explore with my co-author, CZ Means, at the end of, this first article.
That line matters because Whitney Webb isn't just discussing criminal accusations. She's discussing structural influence, families and networks with deep political, intelligence, financial, and corporate connections shaping cultural industries from behind the scenes. And culture itself becomes extremely valuable once you understand its influence over politics, behavior, policing, and social narratives, which leads directly into the next layer of her argument. One of the most explosive parts of Whitney Webb's analysis is how she connects aspects of the 1990s hip-hop industry to covert operations, weapons trafficking, and the expansion of the private prison industry. She specifically references research tied to Gary Webb's Dark Alliance investigations and allegations surrounding Iran-Contra era infrastructure. And according to her, some of these same systems intersect with people connected to Epstein and Leslie Wexner.
Activity in the hip-hop industry with allegations made by Gary Webb in his Dark Alliance series, and some of this, what I wrote about in my book, One Nation Under Blackmail, about Epstein's apparent involvement in arms trafficking during the first Clinton administration, what his 17 visits to the Clinton White House were about, and why he had assisted on behalf of his, main patron, Leslie Wexner, relocating the Southern Air Transport airline, which had previously been CIA owned and had been the main Iran-Contra airline that had been involved in drug and arms trafficking for the benefit of the Contras in Nicaragua.
That's an extraordinary connection because Southern Air Transport wasn't just a mere airline. It was historically linked to covert operations, weapons movement, and intelligence infrastructure during Iran-Contra. And Whitney Webb argues that infrastructure may have later intersected with weapons flooding urban America during the rise of gang violence and prison expansion. And that raises an extremely uncomfortable possibility.
How that was sort of repurposed in this period and sort of had teamed up with these corrupt actors in China's military industrial complex to basically flood urban urban America with illegal assault weapons, which is not really something that gets talked about a lot, but I've always thought is a pretty important piece of the puzzle in talking about, this alleged effort that's touched on here of sort of engineering a cultural shift for the purpose of, for the benefit of the private prison industry.
That statement reframes parts of 1990s America entirely, because if violence, culture, media narratives, and prison expansion were financially and politically beneficial to certain interests, then entertainment itself stops functioning purely as art or commerce. It becomes social engineering. And according to Whitney Webb, figures like Diddy emerged inside that environment, not outside it. Whitney Webb then turns toward the executives and mentors surrounding Diddy's rise. And this is where the story moves beyond celebrity behavior into institutional protection, because according to her, Sean Combs learned many of the behaviors he's now accused of from older, more protected figures inside the industry. Figures who largely avoided consequences themselves.
As it relates to, the Diddy case as well. And he learned this behavior that he's now, in prison for and awaiting trial for from, various other figures that have somehow evaded the kind of charges that now face Diddy. And why is that? So the series is meant to sort of explore that, and also, how this broader, I guess, oligarch network that also has a lot of ties to the Epstein situation sort of pop up in the record industry with direct connections to Bad Boy Records and Bad Boy Entertainment, and some of these other business ventures of Sean Combs.
That observation matters because it changes the question entirely. Instead of asking only what Diddy allegedly did, Whitney Webb asks where these systems originated and why some people remain untouchable while others become expendable. And that leads directly to Clive Davis.
So Clive Davis in particular is the person that is really credited with allowing Bad Boy Records to be a success, because, they really wanted to have been successful if they didn't enter into that very early distribution and promo deal with Clive Davis's Arista Records. When they were created. And this is also true of, his mentor, Andre Harrell at Uptown Records. Uptown Records wanted to have been successful if it wasn't for their distribution deal with MCA.
That section is crucial because Whitney Webb isn't simply alleging corruption in entertainment. She's pointing toward long-standing organized crime influence inside the music industry itself, specifically through distribution deals, payola systems, drug networks, and influence operations tied to major labels. And according to her, those relationships stretch back decades. Whitney Webb argues something that fundamentally changes how viewers interpret elite power in America. Organized crime didn't disappear. It evolved. It rebranded itself through corporations, oligarchs, philanthropy, finance, and entertainment. And according to her, the mechanisms that enabled that transformation were developed.
And it was that heroin ring, by the way, was tied to organized crime interests. Mainly, I believe the Genovese crime family, which had kind of a long and storied history in the music industry through like Roulette Records and figures like Morris Levy, who, for example, funded the first hip hop label, Sugar Hill.
That connection between organized crime and legitimate business structures is central to Whitney Webb's entire framework, because once illicit money becomes laundered through legitimate industries, those industries gain massive artificial advantages over competitors. And eventually, criminal power stops looking criminal at all. It starts looking respectable.
Arguably, it went and the organized crime figures rebranded as philanthropists and as multinational corporations and as oligarchs. And because of this system that was developed allegedly by Malnick, but also others, they're able to sort of launder money from illicit into these legitimate ventures. And so that illicit money pumps up these legitimate ventures and allows them to become hugely successful and dominate their respective industries.
That may be one of the most important lines in the entire interview, because it suggests the public image of legitimacy can itself become a form of camouflage. Wealth, philanthropy, entertainment, and political influence create social insulation around people and institutions that would otherwise trigger scrutiny, and everything for the reasons why it was not a problem. And once those systems consolidate enough power, they begin shaping entire industries. Whitney Webb's final section becomes almost surreal because of how many powerful circles begin overlapping. Hollywood directors accused of misconduct, Netanyahu associates, Epstein defense lawyers, billionaires tied to corruption investigations, Trump world social circles, organized crime-linked financial structures, and according to her, these aren't isolated anecdotes. They are interconnected networks.
And Ratner was basically offered the opportunity to immigrate to Israel, apparently by Netanyahu, because a week before he did so, he was Netanyahu's a guest of honor at the UN alongside Alan Dershowitz, the former Epstein defense lawyer. So quite an interesting array of special guests to have at your UN speech. And Ratner and Packer were actually recently at Mar-a-Lago dining with Musk and Trump.
That level of overlap is exactly what Whitney Webb wants viewers to focus on, not partisan politics, not celebrity gossip, power network. Because the same figures repeatedly appear around finance, politics, intelligence, entertainment, and organized crime-adjacent operations. And the deeper you look, the smaller the world seems to become. That final point ties the entire argument together. According to Whitney Webb, modern oligarchic power may depend heavily on systems capable of converting illicit influence into legitimate economic and political dominance. And once those systems mature, industries themselves become difficult to separate from the networks financing them. 3 facts matter here. First, Whitney Webb argues the Diddy case overlaps with many of the same oligarch networks surrounding Jeffrey Epstein. Second, organized crime influence inside entertainment and finance may be far deeper and older than most people realize. And third, powerful industries often function as interconnected systems protected through money, political influence, and elite relationships. So the real question is not whether Sean Combs committed crimes. The real question is this: if the same powerful families, financiers, executives, and political figures keep appearing around scandal after scandal for decades, how much of the system are we actually looking at?